This is a historically inspired reconstruction. The characters are fictional and events are dramatized for narrative effect. The content presented here is for entertainment and informational purposes only and does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or survival advice. Always consult with qualified professionals before undertaking any construction or survival-related activities. On the third night of the storm, when the temperature touched 47 degrees below zero and the wind screamed like wolves across the frozen prairie, Thaddeus Whitfield stood trembling at the edge of a hole in the ground. In his arms, his 8-year-old daughter Annabelle hung limp, her lips blue, her small body no longer shivering. Behind him, his wife Cordelia and his 19-year-old son Garrett huddled against the wind that cut through their wool coats like they were made of paper. 6 months earlier, Thaddeus had stood in this very spot and laughed. He had called the woman who dug this hole a fool. He had told anyone who would listen that she was building her own grave. He had sent men in the night to sabotage her work, to pour water into her excavation, to collapse what she had built. Now he was begging to be let into that grave. The wooden hatch opened and warm air billowed out into the frozen night, a visible cloud of heat meeting the killing cold. A woman's face appeared in the lantern light below. Gray eyes, calm, unhurried. Ingrid Sorensen looked up at the man who had tried to destroy her, at the child dying in his arms, at the family freezing to death on the doorstep of the home everyone had mocked. She did not speak. She simply stepped aside. "Down," she said. "All of you. Now." 8 months earlier, the April rain fell cold and steady on the cemetery outside Stillwater, South Dakota. The year was 1884, and the frontier was still a place where the land could kill you in 100 different ways, where the distance between survival and death was measured in the thickness of cabin walls and the depth of winter stores. Ingrid Sorensen stood at the edge of a fresh grave, her black dress soaked through, her gray eyes fixed on the simple wooden cross that bore her husband's name. Halvard Sorensen, 1848 to 1884. He listened to the earth. Around her, the townspeople of Stillwater had gathered. They came with their hats in their hands and their condolences on their lips. But Ingrid could see the other thing in their eyes, the calculation, the assessment. A widow now, a foreigner, a woman alone on a worthless piece of land with nothing but a half-finished shack and a dry well. A liability. The dog pressed against her leg. Odin, a Norwegian elkhound with silver-gray fur and eyes that seemed to hold the cold intelligence of his northern ancestors. Halvard had brought him from the old country, a puppy no bigger than a loaf of bread, tucked inside his coat on the long voyage across the Atlantic. Now Odin was 4 years old, and his master was dead. He had not left the graveside since they lowered the coffin. Even now, as the mourners began to drift away, he lay down on the muddy earth and rested his head on his paws, watching the fresh-turned soil as if waiting for something that would never come. Pastor Josiah Aldridge approached, his umbrella tilted against the rain. He was a tall man in his early 50s, with a kind face and worried eyes, a shepherd who genuinely cared for his flock, but who also understood the harsh mathematics of frontier survival. "Sister Sorensen," he said gently, "the congregation has taken up a collection. It is not much, but it will help you through the coming months until you can make other arrangements." Ingrid looked at the small leather pouch he held out. She did not take it. "What arrangements do you mean, Pastor?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Well, there is the widow Henderson in town. She takes in boarders. Or perhaps you might consider returning to your people in Norway. I understand there are ships from New York that—" "This is my land," Ingrid said. Her voice was quiet, but there was something in it that made the pastor stop mid-sentence. "Halvard bought it with his labor. He is buried in it now. I will not leave." Pastor Aldridge opened his mouth to argue, to explain the practicalities of a woman alone trying to survive a Dakota winter on a piece of ground that had already killed one person, but something in those gray eyes stopped him. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of immigrants who had crossed oceans and continents to reach this unforgiving land. It was not stubbornness. It was something harder, something that could not be reasoned with. He nodded slowly and tucked the pouch back into his coat. "If you change your mind, the offer stands. God be with you, Sister Sorensen." He walked away, leaving Ingrid alone with her dead husband and the dog who would not leave the grave. The man who approached her next did not offer condolences. Thaddeus Whitfield was the owner of Stillwater's lumber mill. the builder of half the homes in the territory, a man whose opinion on construction carried the weight of scripture. He was 55 years old with the thick hands of someone who had worked with wood all his life and the confident posture of someone who had been right about things more often than he had been wrong. He did not remove his hat. Mistress Sorensen, he said, and even the use of her married name felt like a formality, a thin courtesy before the real business began. I will come directly to the point. Your husband owed money at my mill, lumber for that shack of his, supplies for his well digging. The total comes to $47. Ingrid said nothing. She waited. Now, I am not an unreasonable man, Whitfield continued. I understand that a woman in your position has limited means, so I am prepared to offer a solution. I will forgive the debt entirely, and I will give you an additional $20 cash in exchange for the deed to your land. Ingrid looked at him. The rain was running down her face, dripping from her chin, but she made no move to wipe it away. My land, she said. It is worthless land, madam. Nothing but rock and thin grass. No water. Your husband dug 40 feet down and found nothing but his own death. Whitfield's voice carried a note of impatience now, as if he were explaining something obvious to a child. I am offering you a way out, a clean start somewhere else. Take the money and go. For a long moment, Ingrid was silent. Then she looked past Whitfield to the crude wooden shack that stood at the edge of her property, and beyond it to the mound of earth that marked the well shaft where Halvard had spent the last months of his life. No, she said. Whitfield's eyes narrowed. You are making a mistake. Perhaps. Ingrid turned back to her husband's grave. But it is my mistake to make. She heard him walk away, his boots squelching in the mud, and she did not watch him go. That night, alone in the shack that leaked in 3 places and let the wind whistle through gaps in the boards, Ingrid sat on the floor and opened her husband's trunk. It was the only thing of value she owned now, not the land, which produced nothing, not the well which had killed him, not the shack, which would not survive another winter. Just this trunk, brought from Norway 30 years ago, passed from Halvard's father to Halvard, and now to her. She had looked through it before, of course, had found the expected things, a pocket watch that no longer worked, letters from family members who had died before she was born, a worn Bible in Norwegian, the pages soft as cloth from decades of handling. But tonight, her fingers found something else. Wedged into a false bottom beneath the Bible, hidden in a space so cleverly constructed that she had missed it entirely in 3 years of marriage, was a leather journal. She lifted it out with trembling hands. The first page bore her husband's handwriting, the careful script of a man who had learned to read and write late in life and treasured the ability. For Ingrid, it said, in case the earth takes me before I can finish. She turned the pages slowly and her breath caught. Diagrams, measurements, calculations. Not for a well, but for something else entirely. A system of chambers carved into the earth itself, connected by passages, ventilated by shafts, heated by principles that had been old when the Vikings sailed. Her husband had not been digging a well, he had been building a home. The last page of the journal contained a single paragraph, written in a different hand than the technical diagrams. Halvard's final words to her. My father taught me what his father taught him, and what his father taught him before that. In Norway, where the winters would kill a man in an hour if he was foolish enough to fight them, our people learned a different way. They did not try to beat the cold. They stepped aside and let it pass above them. The earth is not our enemy, Ingrid. It is our shelter. Below the frost line, the temperature stays the same all year. Not warm, but not cold. 50 degrees, 52 degrees, livable, stable. While the surface world screams with blizzards and burns with summer heat, the deep earth keeps a steady heart. I meant to finish this myself, to show you rather than tell you. But if you are reading these words, then the earth has taken me too soon, and I must ask you to complete what I started. Dig down, my love, then dig sideways. The earth will protect you. Trust me. Trust the stone. Ingrid sat for a long time in the darkness, the journal pressed against her chest, listening to the wind howl outside the fragile walls of her shack. Then she stood, lit a lantern, and walked out into the night. Odin followed her without hesitation. The well shaft was a perfect circle, 4 feet across, its walls shored with timber that Halvard had cut and fitted himself. A windlass stood at the top, the rope and bucket still in place from the day he died. Ingrid tied the rope around her waist, lit a second lantern, and began to descend. The darkness swallowed her by degrees. 10 feet down, the air changed. 20 feet, and the chill of the April night faded to something neutral, something still. 30 feet, and she could no longer hear the wind at all. At 40 feet, her boots touched solid stone. She untied the rope and held up her lantern, turning slowly to examine the walls of her husband's final work. The shaft opened here into a small chamber, no more than 8 feet across, where Halvard had been working when the upper supports gave way. She could see the marks of his pickaxe on the stone, the careful way he had shaped the space, not digging blindly downward, searching for water that was not there, digging outward, beginning to carve the first of the rooms he had drawn in his journal. Ingrid placed her hand against the wall, cool but not cold, dry, not damp. The stone felt alive somehow, though she knew that was only her imagination. The temperature down here was exactly what Halvard's journal had promised. While the surface above held the last bite of winter, down here in the darkness, the earth remembered a different season entirely. She closed her eyes and listened. Silence, perfect and complete. No wind, no rain, no creaking boards, no whispered judgments from a town that had already decided her fate. Only the steady, patient presence of stone that had been here for 10,000 years and would be here for 10,000 more. This was not a well. This was a door. She emerged at dawn, blinking in the gray light, her face streaked with dust and her eyes holding something that had not been there the night before. Odin was waiting at the top, his tail wagging uncertainly. She knelt and wrapped her arms around his thick fur, and for the first time since Halvard's death, she allowed herself to cry. But these were not tears of grief. They were tears of decision. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, Ingrid Sørensen had begun to dig. If you are enjoying this story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring you more stories like this one. Now let us continue with the journey of a woman who refused to give up. The townspeople of Stillwater noticed almost immediately. It was impossible not to notice. Every day from dawn until long after dark, the foreign widow could be seen hauling buckets of earth out of that cursed well shaft, building a growing mound of excavated soil beside the hole that had killed her husband. The children were the first to give it a name. "The grave digger's hole," they whispered to each other, their eyes wide with the delicious terror of the macabre. "She's digging her own grave down there." The name spread through the town like wildfire, carried on the tongues of gossips and the concerned murmurs of church ladies. By the end of the first week, everyone in Stillwater had an opinion on what the Sørensen widow was doing. Most of those opinions were not kind. Dorothea Crenshaw was the wife of the town's most prosperous merchant, a woman of 48 years who had appointed herself the moral guardian of Stillwater's social order. She arrived at Ingrid's property on a Tuesday afternoon, her visiting dress immaculate despite the dusty road, her expression arranged in careful sympathy. "My dear Mrs. Sørensen," she said, watching Ingrid haul another bucket of earth up from the depths. "I felt I simply must come and see how you were managing. The ladies of the church have been so concerned." Ingrid set down the bucket and wiped her brow with the back of her hand. Her dress was ruined, her hair escaping its pins, her fingernails black with soil. She looked nothing like the quiet, proper immigrant wife who had attended services every Sunday. "That is kind of them," she said. "We were thinking," Dorothea continued, her voice dropping to a confidential tone, "that perhaps you might benefit from some rest, a change of scenery. My sister in Deadwood runs a very respectable boarding house, and I am sure she could find you a position as a chambermaid. It would be steady work, a roof over your head, and you would be among civilized people again." Ingrid looked at the woman for a long moment. "I have work," she said finally, "and I have a roof. But my dear, you cannot mean to stay here. Not alone, not with winter coming." Dorothea's eyes flicked to the well shaft, then away again, as if the sight of it disturbed her. "The grief, it does terrible things to a woman's mind. Everyone says so. It is nothing to be ashamed of, but you must see reason before it is too late." "Everyone says," Ingrid repeated softly. "They are worried about you, truly." Ingrid picked up her bucket and turned back toward the well. Tell them not to be. She heard what they said, of course. It was impossible not to hear in a town as small as Stillwater, where every whisper found its way to every ear eventually. Poor thing. Grief does terrible things to a woman's mind. She'll be dead by Christmas, mark my words. The church should intervene. It's not Christian what she's doing, living in the dirt like an animal. I heard she talks to that hole like it's her husband. The last one was not entirely wrong. Ingrid did talk to the hole. Not to Halvard exactly, but to herself, working through problems out loud the way he used to do, planning each cut of the pickaxe, each placement of the shoring timber. Odin listened without judgment. The first true confrontation came at the end of May. Garrett Whitfield was 19 years old with his father's broad shoulders and his father's contempt for anything he did not understand. He had grown up hearing that the Whitfield name meant something in this territory, that his family had built Stillwater with their own hands, that their way of doing things was the right way because it had always been the right way. The foreign widow digging in the dirt was an affront to everything he believed. He came with two of his friends on a Sunday afternoon when Ingrid was down in the shaft working on the main chamber. They stood at the edge of the hole, laughing and making crude jokes about moles and graves and women who did not know their place. Then Garrett picked up a rock the size of his fist and threw it into the darkness. It struck the wall inches from Ingrid's head. She heard the laughter above as she pressed herself against the stone, her heart pounding, waiting for the next missile. When none came, she climbed the ladder slowly, deliberately, refusing to hurry. When she emerged into the sunlight, Garrett was grinning. "Careful down there, missus," he said. "Accidents happen in holes like that. Just ask your husband." His friends laughed. Ingrid looked at the boy, at his expensive boots and his confident smirk, and his absolute certainty that he was untouchable. She thought of Halvard, crushed beneath tons of earth because he had dug deeper than he should have, following advice that had been wrong. "Your father told my husband to dig another 10 feet, she said quietly. "He said there would be water if Halvard just went deeper. He was wrong. The soil was unstable. Halvard knew it, but he trusted your father's experience." Garrett's smile faltered. "Your father killed my husband with bad advice given with complete confidence." Ingrid's voice did not rise. It did not waver. "Do not let yourself kill me with your ignorance." She turned her back on him and climbed back down the ladder. Above her, Garrett Whitfield stood frozen, his face pale, the laughter of his friends dying in the sudden silence. He wanted to shout something after her, some cutting reply that would restore his dignity, but the words would not come. He walked away without speaking, and he did not return. But he did not forget. Summer came to the Dakota Territory like a fever, bringing waves of shimmering heat that made the air dance and the grasshoppers sing their endless dry chorus. The townspeople of Stillwater sought shade wherever they could find it, fanning themselves on porches and complaining about the weather the way frontier people have always complained, as if the heat were a personal affront. In the depths of her excavation, Ingrid Sørensen worked in comfort. 40 feet below the baking surface, the temperature held steady at 54 degrees. While sweat poured off the men loading lumber at Whitfield's mill, while women dabbed at their foreheads with increasingly damp handkerchiefs, Ingrid carved chambers out of stone and shale, her breath misting slightly in the cool air. The main room was taking shape now. 12 feet by 16, with a ceiling that arched gracefully overhead, following the natural curve of the rock strata. Halvard's journal had explained why. A curved ceiling distributed weight more evenly than a flat one, reducing the risk of collapse. The Vikings who had first developed these techniques had not known the mathematics behind them, but they had understood the principle through hard experience. Round things endured. Sharp corners concentrated stress and broke. Ingrid worked alone, but not in isolation. Odin remained her constant companion, lying at the top of the shaft with his nose pointed toward the ladder, alert to every visitor. He had developed a particular low growl for people he did not trust, which included most of the townspeople. The children who sometimes crept close to peer into the gravedigger's hole learned quickly to keep their distance. There was one person in Stillwater who did not laugh at the widow in the hole. Magnhild Hensley was 68 years old, a widow herself for 3 decades, a woman who had seen enough of life to recognize the difference between madness and method. She had watched Ingrid from a distance since the day of the funeral, leaving baskets of bread and eggs on the widow's doorstep before dawn, never staying to be thanked. On a warm evening in June, she finally made herself known. Ingrid was sitting on the mound of excavated earth, eating a cold dinner of bread and cheese, when Magnhild appeared at the edge of the property. She carried a covered pot that steamed in the cooling air, and a look of quiet determination. "Venison stew," she said without preamble, setting the pot down beside Ingrid. "You need more than bread and cheese if you're going to be moving that much earth." Ingrid looked at the old woman for a long moment. "Thank you," she said finally. Magnhild sat down on the dirt pile, unconcerned about her dress, and looked at the well shaft with eyes that saw more than most. "My husband was a miner," she said. "Pennsylvania coal country. 30 years ago, he went down into the earth one morning and did not come back up. Cave-in. They never found his body." Ingrid said nothing. "After he died, everyone told me what I should do. Sell the claim, move back east, marry again." Magnhild's voice carried the weight of 3 decades. "I did none of those things. I stayed. I learned to run the business myself. I made enemies of every man who thought a woman could not understand mining." She turned to look at Ingrid directly. "They called me mad, too, for a while." "What changed?" Ingrid asked. "I proved them wrong." Magnhild smiled, a small, fierce expression. "It took 5 years, but I proved them wrong." She reached out and picked up a handful of the excavated soil, rubbing it between her fingers. "This is good earth, stable. Your husband knew what he was doing." "He was building something," Ingrid said, "something our people knew about, a way to live through winter without fighting it." Magnhild nodded slowly. "My husband used to say something similar. He said the earth was not the enemy, only ignorance was the enemy." She stood, brushing the dirt from her skirts. "I will bring more stew tomorrow and the next day, until you tell me to stop." She walked away without waiting for an answer. Ingrid watched her go, then looked down at the pot of stew still steaming beside her. For the first time in weeks, she felt something other than grief and determination. She felt hope. The second supporter appeared in July, and he came bearing gifts. Sven Lindqvist was a blacksmith, 42 years old, with the massive forearms of his trade and the gentle manner of a man who had known great loss. He had come to Stillwater from Sweden 5 years earlier, fleeing the memories of a wife dead in childbirth and a farm that had held nothing but ghosts. He had brought his daughter Astrid with him, a quiet child who was now 8 years old, and he had built a new life heating iron and hammering horseshoes and rarely speaking to anyone about anything that mattered. He came to Ingrid's property one afternoon, carrying a canvas sack that clanked with each step. Odin watched him approach but did not growl. Ingrid climbed up from the shaft, wiping dust from her face, to find the blacksmith standing at the edge of her excavation with an expression she could not read. "I brought these," he said, and opened the bag. Inside were tools, a new pickaxe, the head forged and fitted with obvious care, a set of chisels in graduated sizes, a short-handled sledge, all of it work of exceptional quality. Ingrid stared at the tools, then at the man who had made them. "Why?" she asked. Sven looked at the hole in the ground, at the careful timber shoring, at the growing mound of excavated earth. "In Dalarna," he said slowly, his Swedish accent thickening the words, "my grandfather built like this, underground rooms for the winter. We called them jordkellare, earth cellars." He paused, searching for words. "I watched you working, the way you cut the stone, the way you brace the ceiling. It is the old way, the right way." He set the bag down at her feet. "I thought you might need better tools." Ingrid picked up the pickaxe, feeling its balance, the perfect weight of it. She had been working with Halvard's old tools, adequate but worn. These were something else entirely. "I cannot pay you," she said. "I did not ask for payment." He turned to go, and Ingrid surprised herself by calling after him. "Mr. Lindqvist." He stopped. "Thank you." He nodded once, a small, serious gesture, and walked away. The delegation of skeptics arrived on the 15th of July, and unlike Dorothea Crenshaw with her fake sympathy, they came armed with credentials. Franklin Pemberton was a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, a trained engineer who had been hired to survey potential railroad routes through the territory. He was 45 years old, with spectacles and a neatly trimmed beard, and the absolute confidence of a man who believed that anything not validated by academic training was simply wrong. He had heard about the mad widow digging in the ground, and professional curiosity had brought him to see for himself. Thaddeus Whitfield accompanied him, along with Silas Brennan, the 50-year-old owner of the general store. Ingrid was working in the main chamber when their voices echoed down the shaft. "Hello down there. I would like to examine your excavation, if you permit it." She climbed up to find the well-dressed strangers and her familiar enemies gathered at the edge of her property. Odin was growling softly, positioned between them and the ladder. "I am Franklin Pemberton, engineer," the man with spectacles said, offering his card. "I have heard about your project, and I confess to some scientific curiosity about your methods." "My methods," Ingrid repeated. "Indeed. The townspeople speak of you building some kind of underground dwelling. I would very much like to see it for myself. From a purely technical standpoint, you understand." Ingrid looked at the group. The engineer with his credentials, Whitfield with his contempt, Brennan with his calculating eyes. "Come down then," she said, "all of you." The descent took several minutes. Pemberton was not used to climbing ladders in the dark, and he made noises of discomfort at each rung. Whitfield descended with the careful dignity of a man who did not want to appear afraid. Brennan simply looked annoyed. When they reached the bottom and held up their lanterns to see the chamber Ingrid had carved, they stood in silence for a very long time. Pemberton began to take notes. He measured the walls, the ceiling, the doorway to the partially completed sleeping alcove. He tapped the stone with a small hammer, listening to the sound it made. He examined the shoring timbers, running his fingers along the joints where wood met rock. Finally, he turned to Ingrid with an expression of grave concern. "Mrs. Sorensen," he said, "I must be direct with you. What you are attempting here is structurally impossible." Ingrid waited. "The load-bearing requirements alone." He gestured at the ceiling. "You have no proper support framework, no load distribution system. The mass of earth above this chamber is pressing down with thousands of pounds of force. The only thing preventing immediate collapse is luck and the temporary stability of the shale formation." "The arch," Ingrid said. "Excuse me. The ceiling is arched. The weight presses down, but the curve transfers the force outward into the walls, and from the walls into the solid rock around us." She pointed to the seamless join where ceiling met wall. "There are no corners, no weak points. The earth holds itself up." Pemberton frowned. "That is a gross oversimplification of structural engineering. The sheer forces alone. My husband's family built like this in Norway for 200 years. In rock harder than this. In conditions worse than this. The chambers they dug are still standing. Anecdotal evidence is not—" "You are standing in one of those chambers right now, Mr. Pemberton." Ingrid's voice remained calm. "The ceiling has not collapsed. The walls have not buckled. The earth is doing exactly what it was designed to do." Whitfield stepped forward, his face flushed with vindication. "You heard the engineer, Mrs. Sorensen. This structure is unsafe. You are putting yourself and others at risk." "Others?" Ingrid raised an eyebrow. "I was not aware that anyone else would be using my home. When this thing collapses, and it will collapse, the town will be responsible for recovering your body." Whitfield's voice dripped with false concern. "We cannot allow that." Silas Brennan nodded. "I've already stopped selling you supplies. Can't in good conscience support this foolishness." Pemberton shook his head slowly. "I cannot in good conscience leave without warning you. What you are building will not survive the winter. The freeze-thaw cycles alone will compromise the integrity of the stone. Water will seep in, expand when it freezes, and crack the walls. By spring, this chamber will be your tomb." "Thank you for your concern," Ingrid said. "I will show you out." 3 days later, an article appeared in the Stillwater Gazette. "Foreign widow builds death trap engineer warns of imminent collapse." The story quoted Pemberton extensively, describing the underground excavation in terms that made it sound like a child's attempt to dig to China. It concluded with a stern warning that the community should not allow such dangerous construction to continue. The article was read aloud in the general store, the saloon, and the front porch of every house in town. The consensus was unanimous. The Mad Widow had finally gone too far. The sabotage came in the first week of August. Ingrid descended the shaft at dawn, as she did every day, to find 6 inches of muddy water covering the floor of her main chamber. The walls were streaked with moisture, the air thick and damp where it had been dry and cool. Someone had poured buckets of water down the shaft in the night. She stood in the muck, holding her lantern high, assessing the damage. The floor would need to be excavated again and repacked. The walls would need to dry. 3 weeks of backbreaking work, maybe more, had been undone in a single night. Odin circled the edge of the shaft above, whining anxiously. Ingrid felt something break inside her then. Not her will, not her determination, but the wall she had built around her grief. Standing in the ruins of her work, surrounded by the evidence of her neighbor's hatred, she remembered Halvard. The way he used to hold her when the world felt too heavy, the sound of his voice explaining the mysteries of the earth, the plans they had made for a future that would never come. She sat down in the muddy water, wrapped her arms around her knees and wept. Odin climbed down the ladder, something he rarely did, and pressed his warm body against her side. He did not try to comfort her with licks or nudges. He simply sat with her in the dark, bearing witness to her pain. When the tears finally stopped, Ingrid wiped her face with her muddy hands and looked at the chaos around her. "All right," she said to the dog. "We start again. Let me pause here for a moment, because this is the point where most people would have given up. Ingrid had every reason to quit. Her husband was dead. Her neighbors hated her. Someone had deliberately destroyed weeks of her work. She was alone in a hole in the ground, crying in the mud, with nothing but a dog for company. But she did not quit. She stood up, wiped her face, and started again. That is the difference between people who survive and people who do not. Not strength, not luck, not resources, just the simple, stubborn refusal to stay down when life knocks you flat. Have you ever been knocked flat? Have you ever sat in your own version of that muddy hole, wondering if there was any point in continuing? If you have, then you know exactly what Ingrid felt in that moment. And you know how hard it is to say those words. We start again. Now let us see what happens when she does. She never discovered who had done it. She suspected Whitfield, or someone paid by Whitfield. But she had no proof and no one to complain to, even if she did. The town's sympathy was not with her. The town had already decided that she was mad, dangerous, and probably better off dead. But two things happened in the aftermath of that sabotage that changed everything. The first was Sven. He appeared at her property the morning after the flooding, took one look at the damage, and began hauling buckets of water out of the shaft without a word. When Ingrid climbed up to question him, he simply said, "Two people work faster than one," and went back to work. He came back the next day and the day after that. Somewhere along the way, he stopped being a stranger who had given her tools and became something else entirely. A partner, a friend. Perhaps, eventually, something more. Ingrid was not ready to think about that yet, but she noticed the way he looked at her when he thought she was not watching, and she noticed that she did not mind. The third supporter arrived in late August. Emmeline Holt was the school teacher of Stillwater, 24 years old, with the boundless curiosity of someone who had devoted her life to asking questions. She had watched the drama of the Sorensen widow from a distance, fascinated by the technical details that others dismissed and skeptical of the confident pronouncements of men who claimed to know everything. She came to Ingrid carrying a notebook and a tentative smile. "Mrs. Sorensen, I was hoping you might explain something to me about your project." Ingrid looked at the young woman, at the genuine interest in her eyes, and felt something ease inside her. "What would you like to know?" "Everything," Emmeline said. And so Ingrid showed her. She explained the thermal mass of the earth, how the ground acted like a massive battery, storing heat in summer and releasing it in winter. She described the ventilation system she was building, drawing diagrams in the dirt to show how the convective loop worked. She demonstrated the hot smoke flue she had planned, pointing out where the stone-lined channel would run beneath the floor. Emmeline wrote it all down, page after page of notes, asking clarifying questions and nodding thoughtfully at each explanation. "This is remarkable," she said finally. "Has anyone else in America built like this?" "Not that I know of, but in Norway, in Sweden, in Iceland, our people have built like this for hundreds of years. The earth is the same everywhere. The physics is the same everywhere. It is only the knowledge that has been lost." Emmeline looked around at the growing excavation, her eyes shining with understanding. "You are not just building a house," she said. "You are preserving something, a way of thinking that people have forgotten." Ingrid smiled for the first time in weeks. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly what I'm doing." September came. and with it the first hints of the approaching winter. The leaves turned yellow and red and gold, then fell away to reveal the bare bones of the trees. The nights grew cold enough for frost. The main chamber was nearly complete now, 12 feet by 16, with smooth walls and an arched ceiling that seemed to glow in the lantern light. The sleeping alcove branched off one side, cozy and private. On the other, a pantry carved into the cool earth, where potatoes and carrots and salted meat would keep at a perfect, unwavering temperature. But the genius of the design was in the systems Ingrid had built. The ventilation shaft rose from a hillock 30 feet higher than the main entrance, a narrow chimney of carefully fitted stone. It created what Halvard's journal called a convective loop. Warm air rose. That was a law of nature as certain as gravity. The air in Ingrid's home, warmed by her body and her cooking fire in the steady 54-degree temperature of the surrounding earth, would rise through the ventilation shaft and escape. This outflow created suction, pulling fresh air down through the main entrance in a gentle, constant stream. Her home would breathe even with the door closed. And then there was the stove. A small cast iron unit, nothing special to look at, but connected to something remarkable. The stovepipe did not run straight up and out as it would in a normal cabin. Instead, it snaked through a 40-foot channel dug beneath the floor, lined with flat stones that would absorb the heat of the passing smoke. By the time the smoke finally exited through the ventilation shaft, it would be barely warm. All its thermal energy would have been transferred to the stones, which would radiate that heat upward through the packed earth floor. She was making the smoke pay rent, as Halvard used to say. Every fire she burned would warm her home for hours after the flames died. Sven helped her install the stove, his blacksmith skills invaluable for fitting the iron pipes and sealing the joints. When it was done, they stood in the main chamber together, surrounded by cool stone walls and warm lantern light. And he said the first personal thing he had ever said to her. "Your husband was a lucky man." Ingrid turned to look at him. "To be loved by someone like you," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "To have someone who would do this. Not just survive, but build, create, complete what he started." He shook his head. "I have never met anyone like you." Ingrid felt tears prick at her eyes. Halvard was the one with the knowledge. "I am just following his plans." "No." Sven's voice was firm. "Plans are easy. Paper and ink. What you have done with your own hands in the face of everyone telling you to stop, that is something else entirely." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her cold skin. "That is courage." They stood like that for a moment, the two of them, in the house that had been built from grief and determination. Then Odin barked from above, breaking the spell, and they both laughed. "We should go up," Ingrid said. "The dog thinks we have been down here too long." The dog is probably right. But before the winter truly arrived, one more visitor came to Ingrid's door. It was late October, well past midnight, when Odin's low growl woke her from sleep. She reached for the rifle beside her bed and crept to the door of the shack, her heart pounding. Garrett Whitfield stood in the moonlight. He was alone, without his friends, without his father's confidence. In his arms, he carried a heavy sack that clinked softly with each breath. "I know who did it," he said before she could speak. "The water. It was 2 men from my father's mill. He paid them $5 each to destroy your work." Ingrid said nothing. She had suspected, but hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. "I should have told you sooner," Garrett's voice cracked. "I should have stopped them. I saw them leave that night with the buckets, and I knew what they were going to do, and I did nothing." He set the sack down at her feet. Even in the dim light, Ingrid could see what it contained. Cement. Bags of precious cement, worth more than a month of the boy's wages. "This is not enough," he said. "For what my father did, for what I did when I threw those rocks, for all of it." He looked up at her, and she saw something in his eyes that had not been there before. Shame, yes, but also the beginning of something else. Understanding. "But it is what I have." He turned and ran before she could respond, disappearing into the darkness. Ingrid stood in the doorway for a long time, looking at the bag of cement and thinking about the boy who had tried to hurt her and was now risking his father's wrath to help her. People, she decided, were more complicated than stone. The next morning, she used the cement to seal the joints in her ventilation shaft. She never told anyone where it came from. The first test came in early November. A cold snap descended on the territory, dropping temperatures to 15 below zero for 3 days straight. It was not the worst that winter could offer, not by a long shot, but it was enough to send the townspeople of Stillwater scrambling to their wood piles and huddling around their stoves. In the underground home, Ingrid lit a small fire for her evening meal, and the floor grew warm beneath her feet. The walls held steady at 54 degrees. The air, constantly refreshed through the ventilation system, was crisp and clean. She slept that night under a single wool blanket, comfortable and warm. When she emerged the next morning, Sven was waiting at the top of the shaft with his daughter Astrid. The little girl was wrapped in 3 coats and still shivering. "Papa says you have a warm house," Astrid said through chattering teeth. "May I see it?" Ingrid looked at Sven, who shrugged helplessly. "She has been asking since yesterday." Ingrid smiled and reached out her hand. "Come, I will show you." They climbed down together, Astrid's eyes growing wider with each step as the cold faded and the warmth grew. When she reached the bottom and felt the warm floor beneath her boots, she looked up at Ingrid with an expression of pure wonder. "It is like summer down here." "Not quite summer," Ingrid said, "but comfortable, always comfortable." Astrid pulled off one of her coats, then another, then sat down on the warm floor and refused to leave. Sven met Ingrid's eyes over his daughter's head. "She is not the only one who is impressed," he said quietly. The winter of 1884 to 1885 arrived early and announced itself with small storms, testing the defenses of the frontier settlements as if probing for weakness. Snow fell in December, enough to blanket the ground, but not enough to threaten. The temperatures dropped, then rose, then dropped again, the weather playing tricks that made people wonder if this might be an easy year after all. Magnhild Hensley knew better. "The old-timers in Pennsylvania used to talk about winters like this," she told Ingrid on a cold December evening. "The quiet ones, the teasing ones. They would say that when the weather plays nice in December, it is saving up for January." "Saving up for what?" Magnhild looked at the sky, clear and brilliant with stars. "For the killing time." The skeptics had not given up. Thaddeus Whitfield still told anyone who would listen that the underground house was a death trap. Franklin Pemberton had written a follow-up article for the Gazette, predicting that the freeze-thaw cycle would destroy the excavation before spring. Silas Brennan continued to refuse Ingrid's service at his store, but the tone had changed somehow. The first test of the cold snap had not gone unnoticed. People had seen Ingrid emerge from her hole in the morning, comfortable and rested, while they had spent the night feeding fires and stuffing rags into the cracks in their walls. They had seen Sven's daughter playing on the warm floor of the underground chamber, while their own children huddled around stoves that could not keep up with the cold. They were not convinced, not yet, but they were watching. The 12th of January, 1885, began like any other winter day. Ingrid rose before dawn, as she always did, and climbed the ladder to check the weather. The sky was clear, the stars fading to gray as the sun approached the horizon. The temperature was cold but not bitter, perhaps 10 degrees above zero. By 8 in the morning, the sky was a brilliant, impossible blue. By 10, it had changed. The wall of cloud appeared on the western horizon, a dark gray mass that seemed to swallow the sky as it approached. It did not look like a normal storm front. It looked like the edge of the world. The temperature began to fall. Ingrid felt the change even in her underground home, a subtle shift in the air pressure that made her ears pop. Odin became restless, pacing the floor of the chamber and whining softly. She climbed up to look outside and felt the wind hit her face like a physical blow. It was no longer 10 degrees above zero. It was already below zero and falling fast. The cloud wall was closer now, a churning mass of gray and white that blocked out the sun completely. Lightning flickered within it, something Ingrid had never seen in a winter storm. The wind was picking up, gusting from the west, bringing the first stinging needles of ice. She retreated to her home and closed the heavy wooden door behind her. The storm hit Stillwater at 11:15 in the morning. The townspeople would remember it as the White Hurricane, the blizzard of '85, the worst winter storm in living memory. But in that first hour, as the world disappeared into a screaming chaos of white, they did not know what to call it. They only knew that the wind had become a weapon, that the snow did not fall but flew horizontally, that the temperature was dropping so fast they could feel it through the walls of their houses. By noon, it was 20 below zero. By 1 o'clock, it was 30 below. The wind gusted to 70 miles per hour, driving the cold through every crack and gap, finding its way into homes that had seemed snug and well-built only hours before. Frost formed on the inside of windows, then crept across the walls, then appeared on the blankets of beds too far from the fire. The people of Stillwater fed their stoves desperately, burning through wood piles at terrifying rates, but the heat could not keep up. The fire roared in the hearth, and 2 feet away, a cup of water froze solid. In the Whitfield house, the finest home in Stillwater, Thaddeus and his family gathered in the main room and tried not to think about how much wood they had left. The fire was enormous, consuming logs at a rate that made Thaddeus wince. But the heat only reached a few feet into the room. Beyond that small circle of orange light, the cold held absolute dominion. Frost coated the walls, tracing intricate, cruel patterns on the expensive wallpaper Cordelia had ordered from Chicago. Annabelle, 8 years old and terrified, clung to her mother and cried. Garrett stood at the window trying to see through the ice that had formed on the inside of the glass. I cannot see the barn, he said. I cannot see anything. The horses, Cordelia whispered. The horses will freeze. There is nothing we can do. Thaddeus's voice was hollow. Anyone who goes out in this will die. We wait. We survive. We can count our losses when it is over. He did not say what they were all thinking, if it is ever over. In her home beneath the earth, Ingrid lit a lantern and began to prepare supper. The storm raged above her, but she could not hear it. 40 feet of solid earth separated her from the chaos on the surface, and that earth was the most perfect insulation imaginable. The wind could not reach her. The cold could not penetrate the rock that had held its temperature since before humans walked this continent. The thermometer on her wall read 63 degrees. Odin lay on his bed of sheepskin, calm and content. The pot on the stove bubbled gently, filling the air with the scent of venison stew. Ingrid ate her dinner, mended a hole in her stockings, and went to bed early, warm beneath a single wool blanket. She slept through the night without waking. The storm did not stop. It raged through the night and into the next day, and the day after that. The temperature dropped to 40 below zero, then colder. The wind chill, if anyone had been able to measure it, would have shown temperatures of 70 below. At those temperatures, exposed flesh freezes in minutes. Breath crystallizes in the air. Metal becomes brittle enough to snap. The world becomes a place where survival is measured in seconds, not hours. On the second night, the Thompson family, Ingrid's nearest neighbors, made a desperate decision. Their cabin was failing. The fire could not keep up with the cold, and their woodpile was nearly gone. The children, 3 of them under the age of 10, were showing signs of frostbite on their fingers and toes despite being wrapped in every blanket the family owned. Abraham Thompson remembered the underground house. It is half a mile, he said to his wife Mary. Maybe less. If we can make it there, we might survive. We might die trying. We will certainly die staying here. They wrapped themselves in every piece of clothing they could find, tied ropes between each family member so no one would be lost in the blinding snow, and stepped out into the storm. Ingrid was awakened by Odin's barking. She climbed the ladder to find the wooden hatch shaking, as if someone was pounding on it from outside. She lifted it open, and a blast of killing cold rushed into the shaft, followed by 5 snow-covered figures who tumbled down the ladder more than climbed it. Abraham Thompson, his wife Mary, their children, Thomas, age 9, Sarah, age 7, baby William, barely 2, unconscious in his mother's arms. They collapsed on the warm floor of Ingrid's home, their clothing stiff with ice, their faces white with cold. Ingrid moved quickly. Blankets, hot water bottles. The children piled near the warm spot where the smoke flue ran beneath the floor. Mary sobbing with relief as the color began to return to baby William's cheeks. Thank you, Abraham kept saying. Thank you. Thank you. Ingrid looked at the family she had saved and thought about all the others who were still out there, trapped in houses that were becoming coffins. How bad is it? She asked. I have never seen anything like it. The cold, Abraham shook his head. The cold is not just cold, it is alive, it is hunting. This is the moment where survival becomes something more, where the woman everyone called a fool becomes the only hope for the people who mocked her. Think about that for a moment. Think about what it must have felt like to be Ingrid, standing in her warm home, knowing that the people who had tried to destroy her were now freezing to death in the houses they had been so proud of. She could have stayed underground. She could have kept her door closed and let the storm sort out who deserved to live. No one would have blamed her. No one would have known. But that is not who she was. That is not who any of us are in our best moments. Now let us see what happens when more people come knocking. They came throughout the night. The Morrison family, grandparents and grandson, had walked 2 miles through the storm after their chimney became blocked with ice and the house filled with smoke. Sven arrived with Astrid, who had been staying with her father at the blacksmith shop when the storm hit. The shop's forge had kept them warm for the first day, but the fuel had run out. Others followed. Families Ingrid barely knew. A traveling salesman who had been caught on the road. The Hendersons, who had always looked down on her. By the third night, there were 17 people in Ingrid's underground home. And then the Whitfields came. Ingrid was tending to baby William, who had developed a fever, when Odin's bark took on a different quality. Not the warning growl he used for strangers, but something more urgent, more desperate. She climbed the ladder and opened the hatch, and warm air billowed out into the frozen night, visible as a cloud of mist against the darkness. Thaddeus Whitfield stood at the edge of the hole. His face was not the face of the man who had tried to take her land, who had laughed at her work, who had sent men to sabotage her home. It was the face of a father watching his child die. Annabelle hung limp in his arms, her skin the color of old wax. Behind him, Cordelia and Garrett huddled against the wind, barely alive themselves. Thaddeus tried to speak, but the cold had stolen his words. He could only stand there, holding his daughter, waiting for the judgment of the woman he had wronged. Ingrid looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. "Down," she said, "all of you, now." The descent was the longest of Thaddeus Whitfield's life. Each rung of the ladder took him deeper into the earth, away from the killing wind, away from the world he thought he understood. The temperature rose with each step, the cold releasing its grip degree by painful degree. When his feet finally touched the warm floor of the chamber, he stood for a moment, unable to comprehend what he was feeling. Warm. The floor was warm. Around him he could see the others, the Thompsons, the Morrisons, Sven and his daughter, all the people who had found their way to this impossible place. They looked at him with eyes that held pity and something else, something like vindication. Cordelia took Annabelle from his arms and rushed to the warmest spot near the stove, where the women were already gathering blankets and hot water. Garrett collapsed against a wall, his chest heaving, and Thaddeus stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the evidence of everything he had denied. The walls were smooth and dry, not the damp, crumbling surfaces he had expected. The ceiling arched gracefully overhead, supported by nothing but the shape of the rock itself. The air was fresh, circulating gently through the space without any visible source. A small fire crackled in the stove, and somehow that tiny flame was keeping the entire room comfortable. He reached out and placed his hand on the floor. It was warm, not just not cold, warm like the floor of a house with a good heating system. "How?" he whispered. Ingrid did not answer immediately. She was busy helping Cordelia wrap Annabelle in blankets, checking the girl's pulse, giving quiet instructions. When she finally turned to face him, her expression was neither triumphant nor angry. It was simply patient. "The smoke from the fire travels through a channel beneath the floor before it exits," she said. 40 feet of channel, lined with stone. The stones absorb the heat and radiate it upward. One fire warms the entire floor for hours. Thaddeus stared at her. "And the walls? Why are they not cold?" "Because the earth below the frost line maintains a constant temperature, 52, 54 degrees. Always. The walls are not cold because they are part of the Earth's mass, and the Earth does not freeze at this depth." "But the engineering," Pemberton said. Mr. Pemberton was wrong. Ingrid's voice carried no triumph, only fact. "His calculations assumed a flat ceiling with load-bearing walls. This is an arch. The weight presses down, and the curve transfers it outward into the solid rock around us. There is nothing to collapse because the Earth is supporting itself." Thaddeus looked around the chamber again, seeing it with new eyes. Not a hole, not a grave. A machine, elegant and simple, using the laws of physics that he had lived with his entire life, without ever understanding. "Who taught you this?" he asked. "My husband, and his father before him, and his father before that. This knowledge is 200 years old, Mr. Whitfield. It kept families alive through Norwegian winters that would have killed everyone in this room. It is not magic. It is not luck. It is simply what happens when you stop fighting the earth and start listening to it." The storm raged for 2 more days. Inside the underground home, 21 people lived in a space that should have been unbearably cramped. But somehow it was not. The constant temperature kept everyone comfortable. The ventilation system provided fresh air. The supplies Ingrid had stored in her cold pantry stretched further than anyone expected. They told stories to pass the time, shared what little food they had, took turns sleeping in shifts on the warm floor. Annabelle recovered slowly, the color returning to her cheeks, her fingers and toes escaping frostbite through pure luck. She developed a fascination with Odin, who tolerated her attentions with the patient dignity of his kind. "Mama," she said on the fourth day, "I want to live in a house like this." Cordelia looked at her daughter, then at Ingrid, then at her husband, who sat in the corner with his head in his hands. "Perhaps we will," she said softly. "Perhaps we all will." On the morning of the fifth day, Ingrid woke to silence. Not the silence of the underground. She was used to that. This was a different silence, an absence of something she had barely noticed was there. The storm had stopped. She climbed the ladder and lifted the hatch, and cold air rushed in. But it was a different cold now, still and clear rather than weaponized. The sun was rising over a transformed world. Snow covered everything, drifted in waves and hills that bore no resemblance to the landscape she knew. The path to her shed was gone, buried under 4 feet of white. The shed itself was barely visible, only the peak of its roof showing above the drifts. One by one, the others climbed up behind her. They stood at the edge of the hole, 21 people blinking in the brilliant sunlight, and looked at what the storm had done. The walk to Stillwater took 2 hours. They went in a group, helping each other through the deep snow, the stronger ones breaking trail for the weaker. Thaddeus led the way, his face grim, already calculating the losses. The town, when they reached it, was a scene from a nightmare. Chimneys were buried in snow, windows were shattered, roofs had collapsed under the weight, and everywhere the silence of death. They found the first body near the church, a man named Peters, who had tried to make it to the feed store and collapsed 20 feet from his door. They found more throughout the day, 8 people dead in Stillwater alone, dozens of cattle and horses frozen where they stood, entire families who had run out of wood and burned furniture, then clothing, then given up and huddled together to die. Thaddeus stood in the wreckage of his barn, looking at the bodies of his prize horses, and wept. The reckoning came that afternoon. The survivors gathered in what remained of the church, their breath still visible in the cold air. They looked at each other with eyes that had seen too much, faces that had aged years and days. And they looked at Ingrid. Franklin Pemberton was the first to speak. He had survived the storm by sheer luck, having taken shelter in a stone root cellar that happened to share some of the thermal properties of Ingrid's home. He was pale and shaking, but his voice was steady. "I was wrong," he said. "I wrote in the newspaper that your home would collapse. I called it a death trap. He stopped, struggling with words that did not come easily to a man of his training. "I was wrong about everything." The words hung in the cold air. Thaddeus Whitfield stepped forward. He had aged 10 years in the past 5 days. His hair seemed grayer, his shoulders less certain, his voice stripped of the confidence that had defined him for so long. "Mr. Pemberton is not the only one who was wrong." The crowd turned to look at him. "I called this woman a fool. I told everyone in this town that she was digging her own grave. His voice cracked. "I sent men to sabotage her work. I tried to drive her off her land. And when the storm came, when my family was dying, she opened her door and let us in." He turned to face Ingrid directly. "I do not deserve your forgiveness. I know that. But I am asking for it anyway." Ingrid looked at the man who had been her enemy, at the broken pride and genuine remorse in his eyes, at the community that had gathered around them, waiting to see what she would do. "You are right that you do not deserve forgiveness," she said quietly. "But forgiveness is not about deserving. It is about choosing not to carry the weight anymore." She paused, looking past him at the devastated town, at the people who had mocked her now homeless and broken. My husband did not teach me to build this home so I could survive alone, she continued. He taught me so I could help others survive. What would be the point of living through the storm if I became as cold as the wind that killed so many? She extended her hand. Teach me, Thaddeus said, taking it. Teach all of us. Build something new here. Something that will survive. Ingrid nodded slowly. That is what my husband would have wanted. That is why he left me his plans. This is the moment that changes everything. Not just for Stillwater, but for all of us listening. Ingrid could have turned Thaddeus away. She could have let him freeze. She could have said, "You made your choice? Now live with it." No one would have blamed her. He was the author of his own destruction, but she did not close that door. And then, when he asked for her forgiveness, she gave it. Not because he deserved it, not because she had forgotten what he had done, but because she understood something that most of us struggle with our entire lives. Forgiveness is not about the other person, it is about you. It is about choosing not to carry the weight of anger and resentment for the rest of your days. It is about being free. Ingrid Sørensen, standing in the ruins of a town that had mocked her, extending her hand to the man who had tried to destroy her, that is what true strength looks like. Not revenge, not vindication, just the quiet power of someone who knows exactly who she is. Now let us see the legacy she built. Spring came to South Dakota in 1885, and with it, a transformation. The snow melted slowly, revealing the scars that the winter had left. Empty farms where families had given up, mass graves where the dead had been buried together, the skeletons of cattle that had frozen where they stood. But something else was happening too. All across the territory, people were digging. Ingrid spent that spring and summer teaching anyone who wanted to learn. She held classes at her underground home, explaining the principles of thermal mass and convective ventilation, drawing diagrams in the dirt, answering questions with the patient thoroughness that Halvard had used with her. Sven worked beside her, forging tools and fittings, translating her explanations into the practical language of building. His daughter Astrid followed them everywhere, soaking up knowledge like a sponge. Thaddeus Whitfield became her most unlikely ally. He used his influence and his resources to spread the word, bringing people from other towns to see the house that had saved his family. He funded the construction of 3 underground homes for families who could not afford to build their own. "I spent 30 years building the wrong kind of houses," he said one evening, standing at the edge of Ingrid's property and looking at the growing number of excavations that dotted the landscape. "I have some catching up to do." By the end of the year, there were 23 Sørensen houses in the region. Garrett Whitfield never told his father about the cement he had given Ingrid, but he became one of her most dedicated students, learning to read the earth the way his father had learned to read wood. Years later, he would build the first underground schoolhouse in the territory, designed to keep children safe through even the worst winters. "She taught me something more important than construction," he would say when people asked about his methods. "She taught me that being wrong is not the end. It is the beginning." Emmeline Holt, the school teacher, documented everything. She interviewed Ingrid for hours, recording not just the technical specifications, but the philosophy behind them. She researched the Nordic traditions that had inspired the design, tracing the history of earth-sheltered construction back through centuries of Scandinavian survival. In 1887, she published a book, The Earth Remembers: Traditional Building Methods of the Northern Plains. It sold modestly at first, but word spread. Farmers in Minnesota and Wisconsin sent for copies. Builders in Colorado and Montana wrote letters asking for advice. The techniques that Ingrid had learned from her husband, which he had learned from his father, which had been passed down for 200 years, began to take root in new soil. Ingrid and Sven were married in the autumn of 1885. The ceremony was held at the edge of her property, near the graves of Halvard and Odin, who had died peacefully in his sleep the previous winter at the age of 5. Pastor Aldridge officiated, his voice carrying a respect that had not been there 2 years before. "I confess," he said in his homily, "that I once thought this woman was doing something unnatural, living in the earth like a creature without a soul. I was wrong. What she has built here is a testament to human ingenuity, to the wisdom of our ancestors, and to the grace of God who gave us minds capable of understanding his creation." Astrid stood as Ingrid's flower girl, scattering late autumn flowers on the ground. Thaddeus Whitfield and his wife sat in the front row of guests, their presence a public acknowledgement of how much had changed. The years that followed were good ones. Ingrid and Sven had two children of their own, a boy named Halvard and a girl named Freya. They grew up running through the underground chambers and climbing the ladder to the surface, knowing both worlds equally. Astrid became like an older sister to them, and eventually like a daughter to Ingrid, calling her more, as if she had never had any other mother. The Sørensen houses spread across the frontier. Some were faithful copies of Ingrid's design. Others adapted the principles to local conditions, creating variations that worked with different types of soil and stone. But all of them shared the same fundamental insight. The earth was not the enemy. The earth was the shelter. Ingrid taught until she could no longer climb the ladder to the surface, and even then, she held classes in her underground home, passing on knowledge to a new generation that had never known a time when people did not build into the earth. She died on a spring morning in 1920, 70 years old, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Her last words were to Astrid, who had grown old herself, gray-haired and wrinkled, but still carrying the spark of curiosity that had led her father to Ingrid's door all those years ago. "You remember," Ingrid said, her voice barely a whisper. "You remember what I taught you." "I remember," Astrid promised. "Then I have not failed." She closed her eyes and slept, and did not wake again. They buried her next to Halvard and Odin, on the little rise above the underground home that she had built with her own hands. A simple stone marked her grave. Ingrid Sørensen Lindqvist, 1850 to 1920. She listened to the whisper. The house she built is still standing. In 1978, researchers from South Dakota State University discovered the original Sørensen house during a survey of historical structures in the region. They found it intact. The walls still smooth and dry. The ceiling still arched and strong. The temperature inside holding steady at 54 degrees Fahrenheit, despite the summer heat above. They measured everything. They documented everything. They marveled at the engineering of a woman with no formal education who had built a structure that outperformed many modern designs. The principles she used, they discovered, were identical to those employed in contemporary passive house construction and in research stations in Antarctica. The thermal mass, the convective ventilation, the underground temperature stability, all of it was cutting-edge building science, developed independently by a Norwegian farmer's daughter on the frozen plains of South Dakota. The researchers found Halvard's journal still preserved in the local historical society, along with the book that Emmeline Holt had written. They found photographs of Ingrid in her later years, a silver-haired woman with calm gray eyes, standing at the entrance to the home she had carved from the earth. They found her final words, recorded by Astrid and preserved by the family for generations. "The surface shouts, but the deep earth whispers. A wise soul learns to listen to the whisper." And that is the legacy of Ingrid Sørensen. Not just a house, but a way of thinking. Not just survival, but wisdom. Not just stubbornness, but the courage to be right when everyone said she was wrong. She was surrounded by the shouting of the surface world, the loud, confident voices of experts and neighbors and people who thought they knew better. They told her the well was dry. They told her the land was useless. They told her that her ideas were foolishness. But Ingrid listened to a different voice, the quiet wisdom inherited from her husband, the knowledge that had been passed down through generations of people who survived because they understood what others did not. And she was right. Now I ask you the same question that Ingrid's story asks all of us. What whispers have you been ignoring? What deep, quiet knowledge, passed down from a grandparent, learned from a forgotten passion, or simply felt in your bones, have you dismissed as impractical? What hole in the ground have you been looking at, seeing only a dry well when it might actually be a doorway? Ingrid's greatest inheritance was not a piece of land. It was not a journal full of diagrams. It was the wisdom to see differently, to look at what everyone else called worthless and recognize as true value. Your own inheritance is out there somewhere. Your cave may be overgrown. Your well may seem dry. The people around you may be shouting about how foolish you would be to dig. But the earth remembers. Start clearing the entrance. Start listening to the whisper. This story is a historically inspired reconstruction. The characters are fictional and the events are dramatized for narrative effect. The content presented here is for entertainment and informational purposes only and does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or survival advice. Always consult with qualified professionals before undertaking any construction or survival-related activities. Thank you for listening to this story. If it touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own strength, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this one, stories about ordinary people who found extraordinary courage when the world told them to give up. Until next time, remember, the surface shouts, but the deep earth whispers. A wise soul learns to listen to the whisper.